Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. This is the second LAMP session this week. Remind you of the note well. Please, if you're going to contribute, make sure you're aware of your rights, privileges, and responsibilities. That was the agenda slide from the first session. This is the agenda slide from the second session. I don't see Elliot here yet. So, and he didn't send slides, although this topic has been suddenly discussed on the mail list during the day. So I suggest that we jump in, and if Elliot comes, we'll pick it up later after the SMIME related documents. So I don't know which person is going to do the presentation. Okay. All right, let me switch to those slides, or are you going to run them yourself?
I don't know that I can run them myself.
Okay, then I will put them up.
Thanks. So I think I'm going to tag off to Bernie midstream here, but it should be just the one slide deck. So, all right. So next slide, please. We're talking about header protection here. So we are looking at, I hope some folks have read the draft. The point of the header protection draft is to extend the end-to-end cryptographic protection for email headers that we currently have just for the body. Since last IETF, we've had several revisions, which are fairly minor, but the big change is that we added 40 test vectors to the draft. The draft is now very long, but the majority of it is an appendix. The appendix is, each test vector is just an SMIME message, and those messages are also published elsewhere. We'll talk a bit more about the test vectors in a minute. We've also taken the time to try to enumerate the list of problems that we see with different legacy clients when they are dealing with these different structures of messages as they come in. And in this presentation, we're going to be making some asks of the working group. So you'll see that yellow color come up with that. Next slide, please. Okay, so the test vectors. There are 40 of them. It's a lot to look at. We look at a bunch of different factors. The goal is to sort of cover a lot of the ground that this design space is looking at. In particular, we look at signed-only messages versus signed and encrypted messages. We also compare, we have a couple of sample test vectors that contain no SMIME at all, so that you can look at a client and say, how does it deal with these different things? We look at the different header protection schemes. As you probably remember from last time, or if you've read the draft, there are two proposed header protection schemes. One is called wrapped messages, and one is called injected headers. We also compare messages that don't have any header protection. For the signed and encrypted messages using the injected headers, we also potentially use a legacy display or no legacy display. The legacy display is a mechanism to try to stuff the subject in particular in a way that the legacy client would be able to view it. A lot of this work is about thinking about how these messages interact with legacy clients. We also look at different header confidentiality policies, whether there's a minimal policy and a strong policy. We look at whether replies are, we look at some of the messages are replies to others, so we look to be able to look at threading. For signed-only messages, there are two different kinds of signed-only messages because SMIME has these different features where you use the signed data mechanism or you have multi-part signed. And the message body itself, the cryptographic payload, could either be simple text plain or it could be more complex with like a multi-part alternative text and a image attachment. So there's all of these features are covered in the 40 different email messages. It's a lot to cover. And if folks think it's too much, I sympathize. I think it's too much, but I don't know how to cut it down. Next slide, please. Potentially, we want even more. This scares me, but we might want to see replies for the unprotected or plain SMIME messages to see whether threading works for that. We might want to consider having tampered variants of all of the SMIME messages so that you can see what happens in a client if a tampered message comes in. That would probably be useful, but that basically double the number of messages. We may also want to consider creating these test vectors using certificates that are issued by certificate authorities that everyone widely trusts. The trouble with doing that is that those vectors will expire rapidly, because I don't think anyone is issuing certificates from like that will last more than a year. And so if we were to build variants of these test vectors that would work with pre-trusted CAs, those test vectors would expire very rapidly and wouldn't be useful for implementers who could pick this up a year from now. Next slide, sorry. So this is the ask for the working group. Have people here in the working group tested their clients against these test vectors? If you haven't, please check it out. We would like to, so there's a link there. There's a bunch of different ways you can get these test vectors. You don't have to extract them from the draft yourself. There's an IMAP folder. There's an MBox you could download. There's a Maildir you can download. You can download the individual EML files if you like. We want you to test your client and make screenshots. Bernie, you're in the queue. You want to just speak up?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Just a remark to the last slide, why we want to do this with CAs that are pre-installed in the clients. It's one of the difficulties we had is to import test certificates to the clients. And if we have like pre-installed CAs, this is expected to be easier. There was just a remark for the last slide.
Yeah, so Stefan asks, why don't we use test vectors with infinite validity? Well, I don't think there are any infinite validity X509 certificates that are out there. The test vectors that we use come from the draft lamp samples, which I will talk about in a subsequent presentation, and those have validity of several decades. I suspect that several decades from now, we will have new information and we may want to regenerate them. If folks look at the repository that builds this draft, you will actually find the code that generates the test vectors. So we should be able to regenerate the test vectors should we decide at some future point we want to rebuild them. But yeah, right now it's several decades of validity, and hopefully that's enough for folks to get these implementations done before we stop caring about email. But yeah, Bernie is right that there may be some issues with importing the sample CAs, and that's one of the reasons that we're considering making test vectors with certificates that are signed by the regular CAs. I don't know that we can do that, or whether we want to do that, but so Tiro is suggesting regenerating them from the repository every month with the latest certificates. The trouble with regenerating them every month is that these things can change, and if somebody does a snapshot at time T, I definitely don't want to ask them to do another snapshot at time, 1 month down the line. I'd like people to be able to say, okay, I looked at the same thing and it worked out the same way. And I'm, the software that is generating these may themselves get updated, and I just don't want it to be a moving target. So that's one of my concerns. Anyway, yes, we would definitely archive any old versions that we did. That would definitely happen. So next slide, please. Right, so this problem is more complex than it looks at the outset. And in particular, what we are stumbling on is the legacy email user agents and how they deal with messages that are formed this way. So I want to outline in this slide a little bit of what the complexity is, just so folks are thinking about this. This may be obvious to some of the people here, but I just want to call out the specific complexities. So one of them is that every message is an interaction between two different user agents, at least two different user agents. Some people have to check their mail in multiple places, and so it's difficult to know for a given message when it's being generated. There's no live negotiation between the mail user agents. So that's a challenge. Some of the mail user agents that are involved will not be upgradable. Furthermore, when you're sending a message, you have no idea which mail user agent the recipient uses. That's by design. I think that's a healthy part of the email ecosystem, but it does sort of handicap us here. When you're receiving a message, you don't necessarily know what user agent the sender used. So that is an additional issue. And then on top of that, different people who are evaluating these schemes may have different priorities in terms of usability, confidentiality, authenticity, other things like that. Those trade-offs, the sender may have a different priority than the receiver in the case of a specific message. But we are looking for guidance that we hope will be universally applicable. And on top of that, let's just acknowledge that existing SMIME implementations are not great. And so what we are looking at here is sort of the difference between the existing SMIME implementations and protections for the headers themselves. So in the course of doing this, we may well uncover some problems with existing SMIME clients, but what we really are looking at here is what kinds of improvement, like can we make an improvement for the usability, confidentiality, and authenticity of headers in these messages. So this is it's a pretty complicated space because of the classic IETF deployed legacy base. Next slide, please. So Bernie and Alexei and I, and Hernani, also from PEP, took a stab at trying to enumerate all of the problems that we are seeing with legacy mail user agents when they encounter the messages that are in the vector, the test vector corpus that we have. We created a list of those concerns. That list is in the new draft. I hope folks will take a look at that list. It's a pretty shorthand list. I didn't try to get into a lot of detail, but you can see specific things that we suspect are problems with legacy mail user agents. We did not try to prioritize those things. We didn't say this one is worse than that one. And you may find that for some legacy clients, there's no good outcome. Like there's no way to have a legacy client that does that solves all of them. You basically have to implement the draft to solve all of them. That's hopefully a good thing. This list of problems could maybe be used by an implementer who wants to verify that their user agent is compliant. We've broken out those problems by the type of message, signed only versus signed and encrypted, and by the context that the message shows up in the user agent. The three contexts that we identify, and this is a little bit tricky here too, but one of them is viewing messages in a list. One of them is rendering a message specifically on its own. And the third one is replying to a message, because we find that there are different problems that show up there. There are some duplications in these lists, in that, for example, some of the same problems show up when rendering a signed only message versus rendering a signed and encrypted message, but they're not exactly the same. And it's possible that the prioritization that we have will be different for example, the same problem in a signed only message might be worse or better than having the same problem when the same problem for rendering a signed only message might be worse or better than the same problem when rendering a signed and encrypted message. And one example for that is requiring user interaction for a signed only message might be significantly worse than requiring user interaction for a signed and encrypted message. We can discuss whether that priority is correct, but that's sort of the intuition that I want to put forward, right? Like user agent developers might think it's okay for the user to have to do some work to decrypt a message, but they shouldn't need to do any work to read a signed only message. Or maybe we decide it's the opposite. But my point is that these are broken out by category here. Next slide, please. So these are some asks for the working group. I hope if you're here in the working group, you're thinking about these questions. We'd like you to take a look at the enumeration of problems that we have. They're in Appendix A of Draft 6. Please take a look at those and give us feedback on the list. Did we miss a problem that happens when we look at these messages or reply to them in a mail user agent that you care about? Are any of those concerns actually not concerns? What do you think about them? Are some of them much worse than others? We want to know what you think about the concerns that are listed there. We hope that folks will do those things. Next slide, please. So At the last session, we had screenshots from Thunderbird, Evolution, Balsa, and Geary, different mail user agents, to see what those legacy agents did with these particular messages. And since the last time, we have added some screenshots from Outlook 365 and Apple's Mail.app. So kudos to Bernie and Hernani for pulling all the other screenshots in. Hopefully they will make it into the repository soon. But I'm going to show you, we're going to show you some screenshots coming up from those. But next slide, please. So this is the ask we have for you. I've already asked you to test your client. If you could screenshot your client doing these different things, that would be great. I note that we have no mobile client screenshots yet at all. So if you have the opportunity to use a mobile client and check these messages out, that would also be very good. Yeah, next slide, please. So I'm going to have Bernie take over here and give us a bit of a talk about, to walk us through screenshots from Outlook 365. Go for it, Bernie.
Thanks, Daniel. Okay, my name is Bernie, working for PEP, and I'm going to show you some screenshots of popular legacy clients. Mainly, the screenshots are now that I follow are from MS Outlook 365, and it demonstrates a few of the identified problems. Not all of them, but a few of them. Then the legend will be, I made some frames around the most important points, and in an orange frame we have the unprotected subject, where in a yellow frame we have the protected subject, in a blue we have the body, and in a pink frame we have the security indicators, in a brown frame we have the buttons to forward or reply to the message. Next slide, please.
To be clear, these frames are pointing to features that we see. The frame doesn't mean that there's a problem. It means this is the feature, and then we can describe the problems that we see about those features, right? So the fact that there is a security indicator is not a problem, but it may draw our attention to some problem or other.
Okay, thank you. So the first case we looked at is the rendering of a signed-only message in Outlook. As on the previous slide, you see the orange frame that is indicating the unprotected subject. There is no difference between the two. Like on the left-hand side, we have the wrap message, and on the right-hand side, we have the injected message. The wrap message is actually the current SMIME standard. With the wrap message, you have to open an attachment that is shown. We show it here. First, you see an attachment, and the user has to click to the attachment to actually see the protected message. Once the user has clicked to this attachment, everything is fine from usability point of view, or almost everything. Like the user sees the protected subject and the body. Whereas on the injected part, like the alternative that is proposed, you see the body, and in a signed only, it looks fine, except for that you don't see the protected subject at all. You don't have any chance to get the protected subject visible. Regarding the security indicators, they are where we expect them. Like on the left-hand side, the security indicator is basically securing the attachment that contains the protected message, as expected. On the right-hand side, it looks a bit more like SMIME currently does.
So let me just jump in for a second. I want to highlight here that as editors, as co-editors of this draft, Bernie and I don't always agree on the issues here. So Bernie describes the left-hand side as looking fine here and the right-hand side as not. And I want to just point out a few of the things that we enumerated in our list of problems that do show up on the left-hand side and don't show up on the right. So on the left-hand side, in the wrapped message, if you look at the message that has been double-clicked, right, once that's been opened, there are no security indicators anymore. While the message was opened from the message that shows a security indicator, there's no security indicator anymore that shows that the message was signed. The user basically has to remember that it was opened from this particular message in the background. And you could navigate away from the message in the background to some other message. So that's a concern, missing security indicators. Secondly, when you want to reply to this message, you now have two different places where you could reply. If you look on the wrapped message, you can see that there's a set of options at the top. that are reply boxes. Those are outlined in brown. There's a second set of reply boxes. So that's a confusion that the user has to navigate. Thirdly, the fact that they have to interact at all is potentially a problem. Users might be confused as to why a message is coming in. They have to do some additional work to get to it. So the fact that there is an advantage here, which is that the secure, the protected header, the protected subject is shown. But if those two subjects differ, it's not clear how the user is supposed to identify which one is the correct subject. We know, because we're designing this, that the one that's outlined in yellow is the protected one. But a user who's simply looking at this isn't necessarily going to know what the relationship between those two things are. So there are potentially a bunch of issues, and granted, there are issues in the other one as well, in the injected header. But it's not clear that we have I think Bernie and I disagree about what the best outcome is here.
Yeah, I mean, I was about to talk about the reply buttons as well, but as I said, with security indicators, you don't see them in the inner message or in the protected message itself, but you basically see them where it's expected, so the whole inner part is protected. I don't see that as a main problem. Daniel sees that differently. Regarding the reply buttons, as you see on the wrap message, you have two options to reply, but the user is most likely opening the message via the attachment and then goes forward from there and leaves the rest alone. That is how I expect most users will flow. Not all, but most will flow, and you will see then how the reply will look like after the user has opened the attachments in the 2 slides from now. To summarize the differences here, the wrapped case, the current S/MIME standard, you have the chance to see everything you need. You see the protected subject and the unprotected subject and can actually compare whether it has been tampered with manually. You have the chance. Where on the injected message, you don't have the protected subject and you also don't see if someone has tampered with the subject. Basically, as S/MIME works now, with that respect. If there are no further comments, we go to the next slide, which shows the signed and encrypted case. In a way, it looks pretty similar, but there are some differences, especially around the unprotected subject. The unprotected subject is now obfuscated, so that it's not visible for an attacker on the path. And again, in the wrapped case, in the current S/MIME standard, you see an attachment. And if you open that attachment, in my opinion, everything is fine. You have another email in an email that you can do everything you need. And you see the protected subject and the content, as well as reply buttons that you can use. However, in the injected case, you don't see any subject at all that is useful. You only see the obfuscated subject, like the unprotected subject obfuscated. This is the main difference here. And with the security indicator, it's basically the same or similar as in the last case, in the sign-only case. They are showing for the whole message, or like they are protecting the attachment containing the protected message. Again, you have here 2 options to reply, and I would expect the normal user would reply to the protected message when everything comes good. Do you have any comments, Daniel? If that is not the case.
No, it's the same comments as last time, right? There's user interaction, there's weird security indicators, there's two different things that you're looking at trying to make sense of, 2 different ways to reply, right? There's a bunch of usability stumbling blocks on the left-hand side, but I'll let Deb go. I don't want to monopolize here.
Can you hear me? So you can only see the subject of the message on the left-hand side? You can't see it at all on the right-hand side, correct?
That is correct. Like in the current S/MIME standard, the wrapped case, you see the protected subject, and in the alternative suggested, you don't see the protected subject. You basically don't see any subject.
But there is a legacy display case that is not shown on this slide that I think
comes next.
In the next slide. A legacy display is a proposed mechanism for displaying the protected subject for legacy clients on the injected headers.
Yes, that will come on the next slide when we're there. Does that answer your question, Deb?
Yeah, but it's certainly a problem to not be able to see the subject at all, right?
Yeah, I would say
Yep.
so, yeah.
It is a problem.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay. If there are no further questions, I summarize again this case. It's basically the same summary as last time. You have to open an attachment in the RUP case in the current implementations. And then you see the protected subject, whereas in the injected case, in the alternative, you don't see any useful subject at all, but you don't have to click to an attachment. Then to the next slide. To actually solve the missing subject with injected headers, there is the legacy display mode that is adding something else. In several clients, this really helps, but not in the Outlook case. In the Outlook case, it looks really weird, and for a user, it's difficult to understand what's going on here. So on the left upper corner, you see what is displayed when the user opens the message. With the orange box, it's marked the unprotected subject that has been obfuscated, the ... which is not so useful. And in the content, you see 3 attachments plus the protected subject, which is marked in yellow. So what you can do is opening the attachments. If you try to open, for example, the text attachments, the stuff in the middle is displayed, which is a security warning, which is actually a nuisance security warning. The text message could be from a dangerous source or whatever. I can't really read it here, but it just asks the user to say, is everything fine with this message, and show the content anyways. A similar thing happens if you try to open the HTML, which is in the lower left corner visible. Okay, assuming we want to see the text attachments and we say, yes, preview the file, everything is fine with this, there's no security issue, then you see what is opening on the right-hand side in the right lower corner. Actually, a text editor opens displaying the text message. You finally see the content of the message. However, in this view, you don't see the subject at all. You only see the content, and you don't see any kind of reply or forward buttons in this view. So you have to go back to the message, clicking there back to the message, and there you can basically see the subject and reply to the message. How the reply then looks like, we will see 2 slides from now. Is there any addition from you, Daniel, or any questions from the audience?
Nope. I think this demonstrates what a mess Outlook is in rendering relatively more complex messages. I will point out that it's worth looking at some of the other user agents as well. At some point, we don't have the time to go through all of them right now, but if you grab these slides, there's a collection of slides in the deck at the end that show Thunderbird and Mail.app as well, which show significantly fewer failures on all of these things. But Outlook is a particularly nasty one. Yeah.
And actually for Apple Mail, you don't have this attachment opening thing. Apple Mail actually displays the message inline. You don't need to open an attachment there. Okay, then let's go to the next slide, which is showing the replies of a signed only message. Like on the left-hand side, the SMIME standard, or as it's called, RUPT, after the user has opened the attachment and clicked on the reply button inside the attachment, everything looks as expected. So we are not showing what happens if he clicks the reply button on the original message, on the auto message, to save you from too many screenshots here. So RUPT, after the attachment has been opened and clicked to the reply inside the attachment, everything looks fine. However, in the attachment, it also looks fine, though the subject is not the protected subject, it's actually the unprotected subject that is used. That plays a role if the subject has been tampered with. On the other hand, this is actually the same as SMIME works now. Any additions from Daniel or any questions from the audience? If that is not the case, let's go to the next slide. So here we show the S-MIME standard wrapped on the left side, in the middle the injected case, and this legacy display mode to help with the subject is on the right-hand side. Again, in the wrapped case, after you have opened the attachment, everything looks as expected. You have the protected subject and the protected body. We are not showing the other alternatives if you play a different reply button. In the middle, we have the injected message. And as you would expect, it's already in the rendering case. The subject is missing and the obfuscated, unprotected subject is used. So you see that also in the reply, you don't have any subject in the reply. And once you get the reply, you get the RE ... and you don't see actually what kind of message it is unless you open it and derive it from the content. In the case of legacy display, in the injected legacy display case, as I explained you last time on the 2 slides from here, that we don't have the content and the subject on the same frame, on the same window, and you have to go back to the auto message. If you click to the reply, you see RE ... in the subject, and in the content you actually see the unprotected subject, ... and below the protected subject, but no content. And this is kind of also a bad user experience. With that, I'm done with my presentation of the screenshots. If there are any questions, you have now the chance. If there are questions from the screenshots, please go ahead. Otherwise, I would give back to Daniel. Okay, there seems to be no questions. Daniel? Daniel, your video is not showing, and I'm not sure whether you're able to speak, but you may need to press some buttons. Okay, yeah.
Hi, folks. Sorry about that. I just had a weird network connectivity issue here. Can we just go back 1 slide? I wanted to make a comment about this reply, the last reply here. And Bernie, I apologize if you mentioned this and I didn't hear it while my network was failing. On the left-hand side here, you see the original protected subject in the subject line. But when Outlook sends a reply, even if it's encrypted, that reply is going to leak because the subject line is going to leak because Outlook doesn't protect the subject line. So while when you look at this, you might say, oh, I see the subject, the protected subject is a useful thing. It's certainly useful to see it. But in this case, Outlook is basically guaranteed to leak the protected subject. User doesn't pay attention to that. So there's sort of a booby trap built into this mechanism for Outlook here that's worth thinking about in terms of if confidentiality of the subject is one of the goals of this process. So, all right, next slide.
Wait a second, just a comment on this. Like you need to focus, like to see here that we are talking about legacy client. So this is happening with legacy clients, what he just explained, with legacy clients only that don't know or that don't implement the header protection correctly as he would wish it, and as we are going to define in the standards. You have also other legacy clients that do not encrypt replies. We have seen that with Apple Mail, that if you send a message and you do a reply, not only the subject is unencrypted, but also the content is unencrypted, unless you explicitly opt in to encrypt this message. So this is a problem, as you say, but we have a bigger problem with other clients that also don't really guarantee that the subject is not leaked. Okay, next slide then.
Sorry, Jonathan's in the queue.
Sorry, yeah. Johnson?
Hello? Yeah. So I was just wondering, and I think Bernie, you just spoke to it, but on the mail.app example, when these different cases, I guess particularly to Outlook, when you replied, were they all defaulted to encryption?
In the Apple Mail case, maybe we can show the slide if you go a couple of slides down to the reply cases of Apple Mail. Then we can show in the backup slides. One more.
We want to
more.
see the.
Yeah.
There you go. That's it.
Yeah, exactly. This is what happens if you reply to an Apple Mail client. So you see here in the security indicator, the lock is open by default. So it leaks actually the whole message, not only the subject.
Okay, but
So
that,
this is a
that
situation-
wasn't indicated in the UI for the in the Outlook example. So I was just wondering, in the Outlook example, were they all set to encrypt?
As I remember, yes, but I'm not totally sure.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
So that's sort of question that we hope folks who are doing screenshots will take note of as they do the screenshot. But yeah, this view of Apple Mail, you can see this is an issue with Apple Mail's SMIME implementation period, and not an issue like the fact that replies to encrypted messages are not encrypted by default is a peculiarity that is unrelated to header protection. And I'm going to talk later today, if there's time, about the end-to-end mail guidance draft, which we just adopted, that talks a little bit about that. So we can maybe tackle that in a different spot that's not about header protection.
Yes. Okay, then go back to the first white slide after my window presentation. Okay, Daniel.
Yeah, so we have not had as much engagement on the list as we would like. I welcome more engagement. I also welcome suggestions about how we could get more engagement. I think perhaps we've had maybe too much conversation off list, and more of the conversation between the editors could go on list. But we really would like to see more help from the working group here. We are thinking about forming this as a design team, but if we do a design team, this is an IETF mechanism where a smaller group of people who are interested in a particular draft push forward and propose something concrete, and then bring it back to the working group. But if we do that, we definitely need to have more than just the editors participating with that. We have asked the chairs about that. They seem open to the idea of a design team, but it would definitely need to be more than just the editors. So next slide, please. The ask for you all is about whether you think a design team approach is reasonable, and whether or not you'd be interested in being a participant in that design team. So I think you've now seen a bunch of the decisions that we are trying to tackle with this draft, the open questions. I think you've seen some of the mess that the legacy clients have that we're struggling to deal with. I don't think any of the proposals that we have in the draft are problematic in terms of fully implemented clients, but as usual, the deployed base is the anchor that's weighing this draft down. So I think that's the presentation.
I'd like to know whether people are interested in participating in such a design team if we form it. If you could just put something in the chat so we can know. We're already 40 minutes into our 1 hour slot. So while they're all your presentations at this point, we're continuing on this. We'll take time from the other two.
They're all tied together, so I don't mind. So Alexei says in the chat that it would be good to reach out to some SMIME implementors. In particular, folks with popular mail clients would be very welcome. I don't know if there's anybody from Outlook who's here. If you are, I hope you don't feel that we just savaged you. But we would love to help you figure out how to make that work better if you're here from Outlook. Likewise from Apple Mail. Or Google, which has, they have the Gmail app on mobile that would be relevant. Or if there's anybody in the working group who has contacts at Mail User Agent developers who they think might be interested, You can feel free to either point them at the working group, or you could point them towards us, the editors, or if you'd like to, you can reach out to the editors. You can certainly reach out to me and give them their contact information, and I will track them down and ask if you don't feel like you want to spend the political capital of encouraging them to participate. But those are some of the wrinkles that we're going to need if we want this draft to actually reach a successful conclusion. I'm a little bummed that nobody else in the working group seems to be volunteering either for the design team. Would folks be willing to participate on list more? What do folks need in order to get more participation on the list if we don't do a design team? So far, it looks like we're just seeing Hernani, who's been working on this from PEP with Bernie, and me and Alexi, which would be basically the editors plus Hernani. Oh, the deafening silence. Russ, thank you for offering to reach out to a few folks. That would be great. Either for design team or for participation on list if it turns out the design team isn't going to work. Thank you, Roman. I would appreciate that also. So I hope that in showing folks the mess that we've sort of landed in, we don't discourage people from working or thinking about this particular draft. This topic is relevant. We've had the specification, as Bernie is fond of pointing out, since a couple SMIME specs ago, but no one's ever properly implemented it to be effective and fully useful. And so, we're trying to figure out why that is. We're trying to figure out if there are workarounds that would make it more usable for people. And we need to, so that's what we need going forward. Thank you, Jonathan. It would be great if you can review the screenshots, and if you are capable of making some screenshots from other mail clients, that would also be welcome. If you look at the GitLab repository, there is a folder of screenshots that currently has the Thunderbird screenshots. It has Evolution and Balsa and Geary screenshots, and I think Bernie is going to put the Outlook and Mail.app screenshots up there shortly as well. And if you do want to do your own screenshots, anybody in the working group wants to do screenshots of a different client of whatever messages you can do, please make a merge request on GitLab. Bernie, anything else to add here?
Well, for the screenshots, I would say we are most interested in the widely spread email clients, like, for example, on the mobile clients, the Apple email client on the mobile clients, as well as the Gmail could be interesting if there are some SMIME implementation available, and other clients that are widely spread are of most interest here.
I do want to point out that it is worth taking screenshots of clients that are not SMIME capable as well, because they may, most messages for non-SMIME capable clients are obviously not going to work, but signed only messages may work, and we may need screenshots of what happens to signed only messages, because that's going to, signed only messages may have a broader impact, because they might be sent to people who simply aren't expected to interpret any of the crypto. And we do need to see what those look like as well. So even if you have a non-SMIME capable client, feel free to just take a few screenshots of normal message plus SMIME message plus the protected signed only messages, and ignore all the signed and encrypted stuff. That also is useful. Jonathan, if you want to take screenshots of Pine, that would be great. Like seriously, I don't have a problem with seeing that. All right, I think we should move on to the next presentation. Elliot, did Elliot make it in? Should we take the next
Elliot's
of the
chairing,
SMIME?
No, he's chairing at another session right now.
Oops, okay. Do you want to tee up the LAMP samples? Great, so draft LAMP samples 04. Next slide, please. Since our last check-in on the LAMP samples, We now offer cross-signed verification paths, which lets people, if they want to use, these are sample certificates for use in SMIME. There are some example certificate authorities, and there are a handful of certificates using both RSA and ED25519. Since we last checked in, we now offer cross-sign verification paths, which means it's possible to test things like trans-valid certificates. I fixed some things in the certificates, like the distinguished names were not ordered by scope. They are now. Thank you to folks who commented on the list to improve that. Next slide, please. The certs that are in the draft, there's a bunch of them. As you can see from this, there are about 12. There's 2 root certificate authorities and using different cryptographic mechanisms. The yellow here means RSA. The blue means curve 25519. For signing, obviously that's ED25519, and for encryption, that's the X25519. You have direct cert paths between RSA and Alice and Bob. Alice and Bob, all of the end entities have both signing certs that are distinct from their encryption certs. With the ED25519 cert, we have Carlos and Dana. And then we have these cross certs where each CA signs the other root CA. Next slide, please. So that permits us to have 2 different certificate chains. Here we're just looking at Alice's signing cert. Either you have the RSA CA as your root cert, and you have a direct signature, that's a complete chain, or you have ED25519 root CA as your trusted root cert, and then there's this cross signature that lets you validate Alice's signing cert anyway. So it lets you look at both of those if you want to test them out. Next slide, please. So the certificate authorities are just secret key and certificate, both PEM encoded. The end entity certs, we have the same, secret keys, PEM encoded, certificates, PEM encoded. And then for each end entity, Alice, Bob, Carlos, Dana, we have one PKCS12 blob that is password locked. It includes both certificates, both keys, and the cross certificates that are needed. And of course, that PKCS12 blob is PEM encoded so that we can include it in the draft. So there's a wrinkle here, which is that this PKCS12 object is PEM encoded. Many PKCS12 systems don't deal with PEM encoded PKCS12, so you might have to base 64 decode it if you want to use it. There may be some other issues too. Next slide, please. I've heard some reports that some mail user agents and some certificate stacks can't import the PKCS12 object in particular. I did some testing on that last night after I wrote this. This slide deck was already published, so I don't have the screenshot for you here. But like Apple's Keychain Access app can't import the PKCS12 objects that are here. I don't have great tooling for unpacking a PKCS12 object and seeing how it differs from one to another. Some possible issues are the PKCS12 object is encrypted with an algorithm that Keychain Access that doesn't know how to decrypt. Could be that the structure of how things are packed into bags in the PKCS12 object is wrong. It could be that the fact that there are 2 secret keys is somehow not acceptable. Yeah, Russ is saying he had trouble with the earlier version as well. So we may be finding bugs also here. Like maybe these PKCS12 objects are perfectly fine and there are just bugs in the implementations. But this is exactly why we want sample documents to work with. Deb asks whether Apple allows key import, raw key import. I haven't tried that. What we found that works is to take, so the Thunderbird certificate manager does accept these particular PKCS12 objects. And the PKCS12 object, if you then re-export it in Thunderbird to a different PKCS12 object, then Apple Mail actually does import that object. I think. There's also some weird caching issues that I've seen with how Apple Mail deals, Apple Keychain Access deals with these things. So it's hard for me to tell without like wiping the operating system and starting from scratch. So Yeah, if anybody has any PKCS12 knowledge, tooling, expertise, and wants to take a crack at looking at these PKCS12 objects and telling me either what's wrong with them or what's wrong with Apple's keychain access, that would be great. If you want to test it on other stacks, that would also be great. Reports to the list would be awesome. Yeah. There's been a proposal that we add an appendix to the draft that has different like steps for clients for how to load the CA certificate, for how to load one of the client bundles, the PKCS12 bundles. We can include that. It feels a little bit software specific. I don't know how folks feel about having software specific stuff, saying like, when this draft was written in, August of 2021, we took the following steps on the desktop, on the Apple desktop Macintosh operating system to import this, and this is what we found. We could include those things just so people are used to using them. So if folks want to report back on the list, we don't have to include that information in the appendix, but it would be good to know if things work or don't work for you. Next slide, please. Barring the appendix and the possible appendix and the weirdness with PKCS12, I'm not sure what else there is to do on this draft. So I think we are approaching a working group last call, and I would like to hear from folks about that. So Bob talks about making real certs with the command line. So if you want to check out this draft contains a makefile. The repository contains a makefile that generates all of these certs. These certs are generated from scratch in a principled way so that they are that they are deterministic. That was a deliberate choice to try to ensure that we can see how the stuff is built. The different command lines are versatile, but they don't necessarily give us a nice view of like what's in a PKCS12 object. If anybody wants to try to do that and give us a nice concise drawing of what the differences are between these PKCS12 things, that would be great. But otherwise, I think this draft is probably ready for last call. We just need people to look at it and give us feedback. Russ, go ahead.
So I'd like to take another stab at the P12 and see if I could figure out what's going on. You said I know where to get the one from the document. Where's the one that has been sucked into Thunderbird and spit back out? So I can compare.
It's not in the document, but I can send you one, or you can suck it into Thunderbird and spit it back out. It should take.
I don't have Thunderbird, so if you'd send it to me, I'll do that.
I can do that. In fact, why don't I just post that to the list? Whoever's taking notes, put that down as a to-do for me to send the two dir encoded objects to the list.
Thank you.
Thank you, Russ. We don't have a lot of time left, but do we want to do the final slide deck? I don't see anybody else stepping to the queue. So this is about the newly adopted end-to-end mail guidance draft. Next slide, please. We just adopted this. It is built in GitLab. If you want to take a stab at making edits, you can use the GitLab interface to pull it down and look for edits. As usual, edits should go to the mailing list, but you're welcome to also create merge requests for issues in GitLab. I'll just make sure that they are echoed to the mailing list. They're there. The scope of this is for mail user agents that offer end-to-end cryptographic protections. The goal is to offer opinionated guidance on usability and security for those implementations. I want those opinions to come from experience with, and I don't think the draft needs to assume any particular user interface, but it does need to assume that these mail user agents are used by humans, and the humans care about the security properties that they're encountering. The draft currently is agnostic about PGP-MIME versus S-MIME, which is fine by me. If folks have an issue with that, we tweak it, I guess. But I don't think there's a need right now for it to care specifically about PGP MIME versus S-MIME. What we're talking about here is what the mail user agents should do and how they should, what sorts of concepts need to be presentable to the user. Next slide, please. So this is the outline of the document. If you've read the draft already, this is no surprise. We start off with expectations about what the user agent's goals are, and some shared definitions. We talk about what are reasonable types of protection. We say signed only and encrypted, and signed plus encrypted is really it. We are not in this draft encouraging encrypted only, but unsigned. The draft is opinionated about what are reasonable MIME structures, and it outlines how to think about nested cryptographic MIME layers. It introduces these terms cryptographic envelope and cryptographic payload, which are themselves used in the header protection draft. There are the sections about how to compose a message and how to interpret messages when they come in, a section about certificate and key management, and a section about common failures that are observed. Next slide, please. So there are a lot of to-dos in this draft, and if y'all are implementers, you probably have some opinions. Please propose guidance for how you think that user agent should work. Even if you're not an implementer, if you're just a user of cryptographic email, you probably have some opinions. They're probably not unreasonable if you're here. Please make suggestions for things that are missing in the draft. Yeah, this is the classic problem for the IETF. We have an existing system with pretty terrible properties. We are trying to lift it up out of that. We know that it will never be completely fixed, but we're trying to figure out how we move the sort of floor of what the expectations are. Next slide, please. So what this draft currently does not have is any test vectors, any renderings of user interface elements, or even a checklist of what implementers should work through. We could potentially add those things. I'm not sure that we need them. I think the textual guidance is the primary goal here. But if folks think that these other things are useful, I'd be happy to add them. Also, if folks want to propose them concretely or to propose other elements, please go for it. I consider myself an editor at this point, although I am currently the main author, but I don't want to be the only author. I hope the working group will contribute hard-won insight. Next slide, please. There is a question about document lifecycle here. Like I mentioned, the cryptographic envelope and cryptographic payload are mentioned in the header protection draft. I expect us to come up with new ideas, and that this document will probably change going forward. So I don't know how I feel about it ever being sort of statically an RFC. But if the header protection draft is a standard and it needs to reference this, then at some point we do need some sort of stable RFC point, I think. So I'm not sure what the right lifecycle expectations are, but I welcome the working group's proposals on that. That's what I got. I don't know if folks have any comments or thoughts.
I'm not hearing any, but we also have just 1 minute left.
In the chat from Deb about size limits, which are interesting. Deb, if you want to propose some specific limits, I'd be happy to hear that. That seems like a useful piece of guidance.
Okay, I think that means we've wrapped up. We can do that. Thank you again, Deb, for taking notes. And we'll see you on the mail list, and enjoy the rest of IETF 111. Thank you all.